The Velvet Paw of Asquith novels. Book 1, The Purging of Ruen, Abridged, by Thomas Caulfield. Read by the author. Episode 1. Oscar drummed his paws on the reception desk. "I think I'm about to be expelled," he said. The receptionist looked up at him. "I'm sorry." "I think," said Oscar, "that I've been summoned here to be expelled." "Expelled?" "Yes." She frowned. "What on earth makes you think that, Mr. Dooven?" "Well, the last 5 weeks for a start." "But you've been on holiday for 4 of them." "I sat in my living room with the blinds drawn." "That doesn't sound like much of a holiday." "Well, it was," said Oscar, "considering the week prior to it." "I'm sure you're not about to be expelled, Mr. Dooven. The notion's quite ridiculous." "Then why do I feel as though I want to bring up my breakfast?" "Was it a particularly bad breakfast, perhaps?" "I haven't had any breakfast," said Oscar. "That's the problem. I couldn't eat on account of my concerns about being expelled." "Well, maybe you should have breakfast," the receptionist said. "I can have some buns sent up if you like. The loud purr hasn't arrived yet. You might be waiting for some time." "No, thank you," said Oscar. "I couldn't eat a thing." "What about a hot fin?" "No, I fear I'd vomit it all over his carpet." "Well, I could ask them to include a bucket." "It's very kind of you," said Oscar, "but I think it's best if my stomach remains just as bereft of hope as the rest of me." She frowned again. "I must say, Mr. Dooven, your concern is surprising. I would have thought you'd be encouraged to be summoned to the lair under the circumstances." "Circumstances?" "Yes," she said. "The ones revolving around you having just saved the world." Oscar looked at his paws. "Well, the problem with saving the world is that I may have broken most of it in the process." She leant forward and smiled. "Mr. Dooven, the loud purr has summoned you to the lair for reasons far from expulsion, I am quite certain." "Then why do I feel like vomiting?" "Well, certainly the loud purr has that effect on Velvet Paws. He can be most intimidating." Oscar stared at the desk and wished he was back in bed with the blinds drawn. "Are you sure there's nothing I can get you, Mr. Dooven?" "I might have that bucket after all," he said. When the receptionist reached for a phone, Oscar left the desk to wait for both the bucket and the loud purr in the lair. He pushed through large bronze doors and stood in the high room known as the catacombs. It was circular, walled by aged oak and draped in burgundy curtains. At its centre was a broad desk with 2 telephones, one brown and one an assertive red. Behind the desk waited a high-backed chair, and behind this was a tall, narrow window with velvet drapes drawn. Oscar wandered to the chair and pondered sitting in it. Being a chair, this wasn't an unusual thought, but because it belonged to the loud purr, it was a decidedly dangerous one. But if he was about to be expelled, it hardly mattered. He sat. The chair swivelled and he played his paws across the loud purr's desk, revelling in a rush of authority. "Did I ask you to speak?" he growled at an empty one opposite. "I am the loud purr. You will speak when spoken to, and only then when I tell you what to say." The lair's doors opened, and in panic, Oscar threw himself from the desk, inadvertently taking a telephone with him, which clattered to the floor in a peal of strangled rings. With a curse, he fought to untangle himself as the refined paws of a battle-hardened velvet paw approached. Unable to, he stood to attention, leaving the telephone to unwind and clatter to the floor of its own accord. The loud purr ignored him, walked to his desk and sat authoritatively. Oscar closed his eyes and hoped the loud purr had forgotten how many telephones used to be upon it. When he opened them, the cat was staring at the broken one on the floor. Oscar glanced at it also. "Are you looking for this, perhaps, your great amazingliness?" he asked, winding the phone up via its cord. "I think I may have inadvertently tripped over it while I was nowhere near your desk. I'm certain it still works. It rang in surrender and a bell fell off, although it might need mending." The loud purr stared at him and then the phone. Oscar put the pieces back on the desk, trying to arrange them to resemble the one that remained. It didn't. Instead, the two resembled a dreadful before and after scene. After blinking at both, the loud purr gestured for him to sit. Oscar did so, and tucked his tail across his lap and into the seat, a bit like a seatbelt. The large cat asked,
Did you have a nice rest, Pantaloons?
I spent most of it in my living room, your great loudness, Oscar said, with the blinds drawn, as you might imagine. The loud purr humphed.
Tell me, Pantaloons, have you ever been to the city of Ruen?
Oscar's whiskers twitched. Well, it's certainly a place I've heard of. I believe it's a wealthy and exclusive city south of Milos, renowned for having no crime. But I've never visited on account of never having travelled anywhere, at least not before a month ago. The large cat stood, wandered to the tall window and moved its drapes aside.
Perhaps it is appropriate for you to do so, Pantaloons, he said, peering at the view, considering you have spent the past month indoors.
Oscar was about to say something, but didn't. The question would be rhetorical. The loud purr told animals what to do. He didn't ask, and if he did, it was only to emphasise the answer he'd then give. But when the large cat whirled around and glared, it seemed he wanted one after all. Well, said Oscar, that is to say, I'm not certain if...
Have you gotten over that problem with your head, Pantaloons?
Mortified, Oscar placed his paws upon it. 6 weeks on, it still felt wrong, all bumpy and gristly amidst his beautiful crowning fur.
It actually doesn't look that bad,
said the loud purr. Oscar remained silent and removed his paws from where his ears once stood. He wouldn't say anything, even if the loud purr expected acceptance that losing them was part of Curiosa. Because it wasn't. He had no ears. And how can a cat be taken seriously if it has no ears? He needed them, and he missed them, both of them. Oscar had little vanity, but as a white cat with thick triple-layered fur, he knew he was a beautiful animal. Or at least, he had been. Unfortunately, my ears still work, your enormous purriness, Oscar said. They just look, well, smaller. The loud purr peered at him.
Actually, you can hardly tell, he said. Really, your fur hides things rather well.
He moved his paws up and down in a descriptive manner.
Perhaps you could sort of spike your fur over the gaps and make it look sort of pointy.
It was a ridiculous suggestion, but Oscar tried a smile. The loud purr peered at the view again.
Still, we digress. Tell me, how many velvet paws of Asquith are there?
Oscar shrugged. 20?
And who has been the newest recruit, Pantaloons?
Well, me, I believe, your big loudness. The loud purr nodded in more uncharacteristic introspection.
And they are all fine velvet paws, having passed their training brilliantly. Indeed, they leave the velvet paws of Asquith to be entirely revered.
Oscar cringed, emphasising his colleague's brilliance could only highlight his lack of the same, and criticism seemed most unfair, considering his recent Curiosa had him saving the world by foiling a villainous cat named the Trembleys. Paws behind his back, the loud purr reverted to his more familiar role of lecturer.
The velvet paws of Asquith are all clinicians, he said. They are sharp of method, taut of whisker, and merciless in pursuit of Curiosa. Whereas you, Pantaloons, have other talents. You are a quite different animal.
Well, that's putting it mildly.
Inasmuch you approach things differently.
Yes, Oscar agreed. My colleagues are a bit like that telephone. And he pointed to the intact one. Whereas I'm more like the other one. He would have pointed at it also, but didn't for fear of more bits falling off it.
Pantaloons, I would suggest that it's actually the other way around.
Oscar stared at him. It sounded like a compliment. Clearly he should have pointed at the second one after all.
The catacombs need animals like you.
Like me? Oscar scoffed. What as? Coasters?
No, as velvet paws.
What, so you're not expelling me, your diesel powdeliness? There was a surprised pause and the large cat glared at him.
Expelling you? Of course not. What on earth gave you that idea?
Oscar retucked his tail into the chair, as its fluffiness often had it springing from wherever it was inserted. Well, for a start, I'm not the same as other velvet paws. I don't get along with them. Frankly, I don't like them very much.
You don't need to like them, Pantaloons. They're colleagues. They do not have to be friends. Goodness me, this isn't school. This is the real world. And it's considerably more complicated than most animals can fathom. And anyway, I find being friendly with animals only adds to such complication.
He glowered at Oscar.
Do you know why you don't get along with them, Pantaloons?
Oscar shrugged. Because I'm a bit wet. The loud purr shook his head.
No, it's because you're not a soldier.
He brought his paws together and leant back in his authoritative chair to stare authoritatively.
We have enough soldiers. Pantaloons, we have enough robots, if you will. What we need are velvet paws more thoughtful in the field. Velvet paws with a gentler approach. Velvet paws like you, Pantaloons, for you are intuitive, rather than logistical, and creative, rather than methodical. You are innately curious, rather than simply obedient.
With a deep breath, he leant forward upon his desk.
You have talents others do not, Pantaloons. You have a mind that is your own, and most importantly, you have discretion, which can be exercised discreetly.
And then came words that surprised Oscar entirely.
And that is why I need your help.
Oscar blinked at him.
You shall travel to Ruen on Curiosa and use your intuition discreetly, and you will tread very, very carefully.
He said nothing more. Your enormous thunderiness, said Oscar. Could I at least have a clue as to why I cannot go in blind? Soldier or not, I'm still a velvet paw, and Curiosa demands some idea of what you require from me. The large cat sank as though holding a weight he tired of.
Pantaloons, all I can say is that this is personal.
And with that, it was clear there was nothing more to be said. The cat slunk through night-drenched streets. Past the midnight hour, for the most part, Ruen slept. It was an hour quiet and still, and left the city at its most vulnerable. Nimble in pace, she edged along cold walls and darted across laneways. Beneath moonlight, she hurried from one pavement to crouch upon the other, searching shadows for anything that oughtn't to be in them. Police, for example, or large empty garbage bins that she might stumble over. She was cautious, but not afraid. Being the police chief's daughter afforded considerable resilience. Pulling her black coat tighter, she clutched a large, full bucket and headed for the part of the city that the echelon of Ruen's wealthy residents frequented. Animals who cared for nothing other than their aged selves. Age should breed wisdom, the Derby often mused to those who fought alongside her in their headquarters, a dance hall named Furballs. It should breed tolerance and acceptance and understanding, not this appalling martial law of oppression against animals such as ourselves. Although the Derby had an extraordinary lisp, it wasn't as extraordinary as the rebellious things she said with it, most of which were damp and left her colleagues, known as the ranks, cowering beneath umbrellas. But as rousing as she was, the Derby let few accompany her on raids such as this. Mind you, her colleagues were reluctant to tag along on the grounds they'd prefer to sleep, rather than scarper across rooftops at night to graffiti dissent with buckets of manure. This didn't bother the Derby, however. She was quite content to do it on their behalf. Moreover, the fewer who knew of her raids, the less likely she'd be caught. If she was caught, it would be disastrous for the ranks. Were they exposed, the ruling council's intolerance of crime would not only have Furballs closed down immediately, but her colleagues expelled from Ruen altogether. And although being arrested would be bad for the Derby, for her father it would be far worse. But stealth and resolve were not the Derby's most celebrated traits. She had another talent for which she was far more renowned. It was a talent that made her a most frightening adversary to the ruling council, a talent that even frightened her. And instead of protesting by slopping pawfuls of manure over Ruen's brickwork, she was seriously considering unleashing it as she had last autumn, especially since manure-strewn brickwork wasn't riling the ruling council as much as it used to. She heard something then, Perhaps a street away, a paw upon pavement. With a purr she melted into shadow and listened, wary of any animal wandering streets at this hour. Certainly it wouldn't be a cantankerous resident. They remained tucked up in their expensive beds, in their expensive abodes, dreaming up means of repressing animals such as her. She heard paws again. An animal prowled. Slinking back against the wall, she retraced her steps to continue via a different route, wondering who it might be. Well might she wonder, for Ruen harboured, this night, a velvet paw of Asquith, a rather unconventional velvet paw of Asquith, one who rather liked composing imagist poetry. In Hotel Ruen, Oscar unpacked, bounced on the bed and looked at some towels. Admiring both the window frame and the view through it, he revelled in that strange lull a traveller finds after arrival. On the street below, animals strolled toward the sea, which hissed and roared in evening shadow. The air was salt-laden and cold, and strings of lights, tied between old lamp-posts, bobbed with the same frivolity they illuminated beneath. Laughter glanced up from windows below, hinting at untold stories. And beneath Earth's growing shadow he felt that tickle of imagist poetry. He refused its call, still puzzled as to why he'd been assigned here. It had been more through request than order, which was odd, considering how clinical the loud purr was in assigning velvet paws to Curiosa. Later that evening, unable to sleep, Oscar decided to go for a walk. He wandered through cobbled streets, passing 3-story abodes, their plastered stone tinged blue. On their balconies, washing aired in the crisp night. Shutters were thrown wide to allow rooms to do the same. Above, the sky was scried by moonlight-edged roofs and seemed brighter than any sun-drenched day. Reflective steps, Oscar thought. That is how it always began, words meaningless until others arrived. The verse arose and then dispersed like breath, already forgotten. It didn't bother him. To steal such lines with pen seemed predatory. To acknowledge with voice was enough. In reflective steps I peruse your lines, and pace your rectangular ground, with narrow walls in shades of blue, and cast silvered night around. Beyond these whitewashed walls I feel a curious edge to me, the deepest call of timeless shore. I heed that sound of sea. When returning to Hotel Ruen, Oscar turned a corner and stopped to stare in surprise. On the pavement opposite, a cat painted frantically on the wall, her paws flailing between brickwork and a bucket like a pair of ladles. Her graffiti was messy and sloppy, and where application had been too liberal, lumps splattered to the pavement. She used her bare paws too, and the smell suggested her medium was raw sewage. None of this gave credence to her words, nor did her lack of grammar. There ought to be a comma after alone, Oscar said, stepping from the pavement and pointing at her error. And I think you'll find that bugger is spelt with 2 G's. Whirling around, the derby inadvertently flung feces across his beautifully night-aired pantaloons. This left him with only marginally less surprise than she. As a result, both cats stared. The derby recovered first. With her ears flat, she hissed and flung manure at him again before bounding away. Oscar stared after her, still pointing at the word bugger, strewn across the wall.